They told us this outpost was abandoned for centuries. That whatever silence lingered beneath the fractured moons of Deneb 6 was harmless empty. But silence, as we quickly learned, isn't proof of absence. It's a rehearsal for the return of something long forgotten. When the Helios Ascendant arrived at orbit, its scanners read nothing. No heat signatures. No power surges. No movement. Just the cold geometry of the alien base, embedded like a parasite inside the asteroid's iron crust. But we didn't come for ghosts. We came for legacy, for secrets, for anything that would push humanity one rung higher on the cosmic ladder. And we would bleed for every inch. They sent in Recon Team Theta first, 5 men and women born of war, hardened by vacuum, carrying enough firepower to vaporize a minor civilization. They were gone in 11 minutes. No warning. No static. Just flatline. We watched it all through grainy black feeds, helmet cams trembling in darkness, eyes catching flashes of movement that never fully emerged. A shape that didn't walk, didn't crawl. It shimmered between frames like it didn't agree with reality. Then screams. Not human, not alien. Just ancestral. Like something buried deep inside our DNA recognized what we couldn't explain. Command called it a signal anomaly. A misfire. They said the team likely breached an unstable chamber. But we knew better. Those screens weren't mechanical. So they sent us Omega Division. Not because we were smarter. Not because we were braver. But because we were expendable. We docked at sublevel 6, where even light didn't want to stay. The airlock opened, and the first thing we noticed wasn't the smell, it was the absence of smell. As if the atmosphere had been stripped clean of memory. And beneath our boots, the glass floors weren't just transparent, they were layered with something moving. Microscopic pulses, like veins. Like the base was breathing. Dr. Vasquez whispered something about organic circuitry. Bioconduction lattices fused with architecture. Living walls. Thinking walls. The base wasn't built. It was born. We split up, standard protocol. But I could feel it, even before we lost comms. The halls weren't empty. They were listening. Watching. Learning us. And then the base began to change. Not all at once. But subtly. A corridor curved differently than before. A panel that wasn't there now blinked softly with alien script. Our footsteps echoed. Back wrong, half a beat delayed. As if we were walking beside versions of ourselves we couldn't see. Or didn't want to. Then, Private Sorek screamed. It wasn't pain, it was comprehension. She collapsed, whispering. Numbers. Star maps. Equations too fast for her tongue. Blood ran from her eyes, forming spirals. On the floor. The base had shown her something. Not with light, not with sound, but directly. Into her neural substrate. A memory that didn't belong to her. Or to us, she said one thing before losing consciousness, it's not abandoned. It's waiting. And now, so are we. You don't measure time inside this space the way you do on Earth. Seconds dissolve into pulses. Minutes stretch across corridors that loop back into themselves. It's not the clocks that betray you, it's your own certainty. Down here, the mind drips apart like condensation on glass. And as we moved deeper, we realized the corridors weren't just shifting, they were studying us. Rebuilding themselves based on how we reacted. A maze, yes. But not one made to trap. One made to understand. Sergeant Halden was the first to notice it. His HUD stopped responding to manual input. Not frozen, just wrong. Icons replaced by glyphs that reformed with every blink. When he stared too long at the floor, his boots vanished beneath him, swallowed by a surface that mimicked solidity. He didn't fall. He merged. Pulled downward, not physically, but neurologically. He kept saying the same word over and over again, even after we severed his feed. Reflected. 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 We sedated him. No response. But his EEG spiked violently, forming patterns that Dr. Vasquez said resembled solar flare rhythms. Like the sun screaming in binary. The walls began to grow teeth. Not literally. But they projected images, fractals formed of bone and stardust. Every panel we passed displayed memories from our lives. My father's voice played from an intercom that hadn't worked in decades. Sorek saw a mirror reflecting her as a child, curled in her mother's lap, only her mother had no eyes, just shimmering ink-black voids. The base wasn't reading us. It was recreating us. Then came the lattice room 47A, a chamber spherical in shape and laced with connective tissue that glowed faintly blue. No doors. No interface. Just strands, thousands of them, reaching from the ceiling to the floor, pulsing like veins. When Vasquez touched one, she gasped and collapsed. Her eyes rolled back, and her voice returned, but not hers. It spoke in harmonic layers. Multiple tones in synchronization. Each sentence started before the last ended. A message from something that did not comprehend linearity. She said, "You are neural interference, spiking signal beneath skin. The vessel is acceptable. Language approximated. Memory stitch active. Host welcome initiated." Then her mouth stopped moving, but we still heard her. In our heads. The lattice had connected her, neuron by neuron, into something larger than any species we'd ever known. It wasn't uploading her, it was synchronizing with her. Turning her into a bridge. She whispered, from somewhere behind her own eyes, "It doesn't see us as threats. It sees us as missing pieces." That's when we understood, this base isn't a building. It's a being. A brain. Not dormant, but dormant in the way a sleeper is still alive, still dreaming. And every step we took were stepping onto synapses. Touching dendrites. Lighting up pathways that hadn't fired in eons. The base was remembering itself. And through us, it was waking up. Memory doesn't behave the same here. It bleeds forward and backward, wrapping itself around perception like a suffocating vine. You'll forget your name, but remember a scream you haven't heard yet. That's what happened when we entered the atrium, a misnamed chamber shaped not for congregation, but for communion. A dome taller than any structure on Earth, its curvature lined with strands of bioluminescent filaments twitching like the inside of a giant optic nerve. As we stepped in, something changed, not the environment, but us. Private Core slowed first. His pupils dilated to full black. His vitals dropped, then spiked with impossible precision, every breath a metronome. He walked forward, unafraid, eyes locked on a spiral etched into the floor. It pulsed with colors we didn't have names for, and yet they felt familiar, like lullabies forgotten in the womb. He touched the center of the spiral, and instantly the room responded. Light unfurled from the ceiling, not beams, not rays, but strands of thought. They weren't just illuminating the space, they were speaking. Pulsing, flickering, twisting. Each light a sentence. Each color a dialect. We didn't need translators, the meaning bypassed language and went straight into the brain's primal root. And what we felt wasn't terror. It was belonging. Kor turned to us, but his voice had changed. Not just in tone, but in origin. He was speaking with the atrium now. A duality, his words layered with a second voice that was ancient and synthetic and beautiful. "This is not a tomb," he said. "This is an invitation." Then the walls shifted, not mechanically, but organically, like muscle reacting to stimulus. Flesh that remembered movement. The entire chamber was alive, and it had been waiting, dormant, for minds complex enough to complete its code. Our symbols poured from the floor, climbing the walls like liquid glass. Glyphs formed into equations, then into songs, auditory hallucinations broadcast into our thoughts. Each of us heard something different. I heard my sister's voice, long dead, reciting prime numbers in reverse. Sorek dropped to her knees, laughing and sobbing as the bass showed her a version of Earth where war had never happened. "And Halden," he screamed. Not out of fear, but out of knowing. He saw the thing before any of us, the form hidden in the structure, not a creature, but an interface. A being spread across time and stone and light. One that had once spoken to galaxies the way we speak to fire. The atrium was its tongue. We were inside its mouth. And then the lights dimmed. One by one. Not in fear. Not in threat. But as if concluding a sentence. Kor collapsed, unconscious, smiling. His neural scan showed activity across every known region, frontal lobe, motor cortex, cerebellum, and 6 other zones no human had ever mapped. The message was simple. You are keys. You are doors. You are not alone. That's when we heard the sound. Not mechanical. Not natural. A heartbeat. Slow. Measured. Ancient. And beneath our feet, the spiral began to turn. They always teach you in training that survival depends on understanding terrain. Learn the lines of a battlefield, and you might live long enough to leave it. But here, inside this ancient structure, cradled in the dark of space, the terrain learns you. It adapts. It digests. And once it knows your rhythm, your breath, your panic, it begins to shape around you like a memory you never made. That's what we discovered in the hollow spine. It wasn't marked on the base's crude topology map, nothing down here ever is. We found it by mistake, chasing a pulse reading that mimicked Vasquez's neural pattern, even though she'd been unconscious for hours. A corridor folded open without sound, revealing a descent that wasn't carved but grown. Ribs of obsidian and silver curved inward, forming a vertical tunnel that breathed mist and murmured names we didn't recognize. Not through sound, through pressure. Pressure that bloomed inside our bones like someone whispering from within the marrow. Sorek led the descent, rope tethered to Halden. Every step downward made the space narrower. More intimate. But it wasn't physical compression. It was psychological. You could feel your thoughts reducing, streamlining, shedding unnecessary memories as if the base demanded cognitive efficiency. By the time we reached the chamber, I couldn't recall my birth name. It opened like a wound, a sphere of raw architecture, walls slick with translucent veins that pulsed with dull violet light. And inside those veins, not blood, but fragments. Fragments of something living, twitching, flickering like trapped neurons. Each pulse carried a voice, not ours. Not human, yet eerily close. They spoke in unison, overlapping with perfect chaos. Phrases poured into our ears and minds, simultaneous translations in hundreds of languages, most extinct, some never spoken. We are the remains of choice. That was the first sentence. Then they began to show us. Through the veins, the base projected history. Not as footage. Not as hallucination. As feeling. Emotional resonance thickened the air, sorrow that weighed like Gravity, triumph that burned cold, awe that left our mouths dry. We saw civilizations not just fall, but return. Time here was not linear, it was recursive. Species who had once awakened the base were reduced to static in its memory. Echoes of those who believed they could bond with it. Or command it. That was their mistake. And then we saw one of them. The architects. Or perhaps their children. Tall, hollow-chested beings with faces like shattered mirrors and eyes that shimmered with interior galaxies. They didn't speak with sound, but with gesture, slow, deliberate motions that made the veins throb. With knowledge. They hadn't created the base. They had found it. And tried to become one with it. They failed. We remember their shape. We do not remember their names. Vasquez opened her eyes for the first time in 2 hours. She stared at the ceiling and whispered. This base is a sarcophagus, but not for bodies. For attempts. It isn't keeping something trapped. It's keeping the idea of something from escaping. And now we'd entered its bloodstream. There comes a point when you stop asking where you are and begin asking what you've become. After the hollow spine, nothing inside us remained untouched. We weren't infected. We weren't corrupted. We were restructured. Thought wasn't linear anymore. Emotions had flavors. Time was a hallway we could walk down in both directions. And at the center of it all, like gravity around a collapsed star, was the signal. Constant. Pulsing. Untranslated. Not a message, but a state of being. We followed it into the drowned archive. It was a hall submerged in liquid that never dripped. A levitating ocean suspended across miles of transparent lattice. No floor. No ceiling. Just a sphere of memory water held together by fields we couldn't detect. The moment we stepped in, our boots hovered, gravity abandoning us like it had made other plans. The liquid touched our suits, but it didn't soak, it entered. Osmotic. Intentional. Intelligent. Every surface of our suits lit up with data. Not bytes. Not code. But moments. Each breath we took loaded us with recollections, some ours, some foreign. Holden convulsed as he spoke in tongues, narrating events from a war on a planet called Vephyr 3, where fire sang and soldiers never died, only changed species. Sorek began humming a lullaby that made our eyes tear up, even though we couldn't recall ever hearing it before. And God help me, I remembered my death. Not metaphorically. I died. Saw myself from above, crushed beneath stone and static, surrounded by an alien crowd that chanted in reverse. My heart stopped. For 27 seconds, I was gone. When I came back, my first thought wasn't fear. It was recognition. Like that death had happened before. That's when the drowned minds appeared. Figures in the liquid. Not swimming. Not floating. Stalled. Motionless shadows suspended in time. Some were humanoid. Others were not. Each one connected to tendrils extending from the glass shell, like nerves tied to memory cores. Vasquez called them neural librarians. Preserved. Thinkers. Philosophers, tacticians, dreamers, all drowned in the sea of thought to become part of the base's collective intelligence. Not prisoners. Volunteers. Their brains were still alive. Flickering. Thinking. The base was using them as processors, souls. Threaded through architecture. The deeper we went, the more of them we saw, some encased in crystal, others open-eyed, watching, knowing. One turned to me. No words. Just a sensation that folded inside my skull. The cost of truth is identity. I felt it then, what they'd given up. Their names, faces, individuality erased to make room for pure cognition. Each one a neuron. Each neuron part of a machine that wasn't built to conquer, but to understand. The drowned minds hadn't died. They had become. We floated there, reverent, silent. Then Vasquez whispered, "This isn't an archive. It's a decision engine." And it had just started thinking again. Some architectures aren't meant to be walked through. They're meant to be endured. That truth bled into us when we reached the next structure, a tower that wasn't a tower, not in shape, not in purpose. The spire rose not vertically, but conceptually. A place you didn't climb with feet, but with acceptance. Its entrance didn't exist until we stopped searching for it. And once it opened, none of us were the same again. Vasquez called it quantum sympathetic geometry, walls that rebuilt themselves based on your internal contradictions. The spire could read guilt, doubt, shame. It fed on moral failure like oxygen. And as we moved upward or inward, or backward, each level stripped a layer of illusion from our psyches, peeling away the lies we'd told ourselves to stay sane. The first floor showed us choices we'd buried. Sarek relived the mission where she left a wounded crewman behind to save 3 others. We watched the moment loop, the man's eyes wide with betrayal, again and again, until Sarek dropped her weapon and whispered, "I thought I made peace with that." But the spire disagreed. The second floor was worse. It showed us what we could have been. Holden saw a version of himself on Earth, child in one arm, guitar in the other, laughing beneath cherry blossoms that never bloomed in his real timeline. He screamed to touch it, begged the glass membrane to break, but the memory was sealed, unreachable. And I saw myself. Not in uniform, but in a library, older, teaching children how to read alien glyphs like fairy tales. My heart broke for a future I never had the courage to choose. This was the spire's punishment, not pain, but possibility. At the 3rd level, it changed. No more memories. Only symbols. They came fast, flashing like retinal imprints, each glyph forcing a new emotion into our chests. Symbols that made us sob, laugh, rage, feel guilt for things we hadn't done. Each of us collapsed, overwhelmed by a flood of perception we weren't meant to process. The spire wasn't just a test. It was a machine designed to refine will. A filter. A crucible. One voice spoke through the chamber. Not from the walls, but from inside us. You are errors made of choice. Remade by regret. Only those who know what they could have been may become what they must. And then came the climb. Not of stairs. Not of ladders. Of sacrifice. Each step forward required us to relinquish something from within. Holden lost his hatred, he tried to speak but couldn't remember what anger was. Sarek gave up her name, her badge. Blinked blank, and she no longer responded to it. Vasquez gave up her identity as human. Horror. Voice echoed differently now, slower, deliberate, half in thought patterns. And I gave up my fear. Not courage. Just the survival reflex. The part of me that used to whisper, "Don't go farther." And in its place, silence. Not emptiness. Readiness. At the summit of the spire, there was no beacon. No light. Just a smooth panel of obsidian. Embedded with living circuitry. It pulsed once, acknowledged our ascent. Then came the final phrase, etched in fire behind our eyes. To join the architect, first forget who built you. And the floor opened. We fell, not down. But deeper by now, we weren't explorers anymore. We were symptoms, manifestations within the anatomy of something older than strategy, older than stars. the base no longer responded to our movements, it anticipated them. Corridors opened before we arrived. Doors ceased to exist. Unless we deserved them. It wasn't reacting. It was remembering through us. And it led us to the intake core, where sound had no beginning, and silence had already been erased. The room had no corners. It wasn't a space built for observation, it was built for conversion. Cylindrical, pulsating with invisible fields that tugged at our thoughts like gravitational waves. Bending reason. The walls were lined with anchors, vertical channels where light and shadow traded places in impossible symmetry. As we entered, the frequency hit us. A low thrumming. Beneath language. Not sound, but compression of intent. Halden vomited. Not from sickness, but from memory. His body trying to purge something that hadn't happened yet. Vasquez stood utterly still, arms slightly raised, as if her bones remembered. Worship. And I felt a name enter my mind that didn't belong to me. Karima. Not mine. Not anyone's. But real. Like the name of a wound. In the center of the core was a shape. Not an object. Not a machine. A gesture. A floating cluster. Of geometries that rearranged every time we looked directly at it. It behaved like meaning. Shifting to match whoever tried to understand it. When Vasquez stared, it took the form of a Mobius loop. When Halden looked, it fractured into 3 spirals chasing one another like a predator, prey, and observer. And when I locked eyes with it, it became my childhood bedroom. Every detail exact. Even the smell of copper in the carpet. Then it blinked out. Gone. Replaced by nothingness. It knew who I had been. And it had no use for it. Then the voices started. Not hallucinations. Not synthetic mimicry. These were recordings. Echoes preserved in atomic memory. Dozens. Hundreds. Voices of past expeditions, alien dialects twisted into desperation. 1,000 endings replayed in chaotic sync. Some begged. Some warned. Some laughed. One phrase echoed louder than the others. Repeating in dozens of languages. We tried to feed it a god. And after a long pause, it fed us to itself. The floating construct expanded. It released filaments of burning light, harmless, but deeply personal. One thread touched Sorak's shoulder and she collapsed, eyes wide, lips mouthing something soundless. When we revived her, she whispered only one thing. It's hungry, but it doesn't eat. The core began to rotate around us. We weren't standing on anything, but still, we felt the spin. Inside our suits, our vitals adjusted to an orbit that didn't exist. A physical response to a philosophical gravity. The base was showing us what it wanted. Not obedience. Not sacrifice. Continuation. It didn't care who we were. It only wanted us to go further. And so, we did.